Well, this will be interesting because during the live broadcast, my internet and Zoom dropped about 4 times. So my coverage of Acts 4 through 1 through 22 is going to be all chopped up. This is verse 13 that the two main videos omitted. So I wanted to cover that, and hopefully, Lord willing, I'll be able to figure out how to splice all this together. Um, Verse 13. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated and untrained men, they marveled and they realized they had been with Jesus. If I could um, demonstrate a facial expression of what the Jewish leadership looked like when they heard Peter piecing this logic together and how eloquent he was and how bulletproof his arguments were, this is their facial expression. I mean, that says it all. They marveled. These are uneducated, untrained men. How, how are they setting us back on our heels? And I love the last sentence of verse 13. We're going to camp out there in a minute. But before I do, let's talk about uneducated and untrained. Now, on one hand, that statement is true. Peter and John had no formal education. They had no formal training through a rabbinical school or anything of that nature. By the way, neither had Jesus. Um, and so these very well educated men are marveling at how well they're piecing all this together, pulling scripture from the Old Testament, applying it to the current times, and they're marveling at that. So, on one hand, they were untrained or uneducated. But on the other hand, and this is probably the more important hand, they had just spent 3 years with Jesus, the third person of the Trinity, the creator of the universe, the one in whom the rabbinical schools attempted to teach. They got that one on one instruction. Gee, I wonder which one would be better. So, what I like is that they noticed that Peter and John had been with Jesus, that they didn't attribute this to some fluke or some, um, you know, oh, Peter and John, they must have spent the night at a Holiday Inn Express. Look how smart they are now. No, they attributed their intelligence, their logic, their reasoning, and their knowledge of Scripture. They attributed it all because they had spent time with Jesus. Now, which one is more important? I hear two camps out there. I've been a Christian over 40 years. I've heard in some charismatic and Pentecostal camps, there can be some looking down upon people who go to seminary and get a formal education, as if that's handicapping them from being used by the Spirit. They tend to elevate being led by the Spirit and downplaying formal education through seminaries and so forth as being somehow a handicap. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people from certain denominations who look at the laity. For instance, I'm laity, I've never had any formal seminary training. Uh, they look at laity as a bunch of yahoos. These are people that, well, they wouldn't say it out loud or maybe even put it in print, but they're very proud of the letters after their name denoting their bachelor's, master's, or doctorate in the School of Divinity. So when you are looking at which camp is correct, I'm going to tell you they're both correct and they're both wrong. Basically, when I look for examples in the Bible, I get plenty of examples of men from the Bible who had great education through the school of experience of walking with God, and they went on to do massive things for God. And I see people in the Bible and afterwards who had formalized education, formalized training through seminaries or rabbinical school, who also God did great things. Let me just run you down a quick list of the who's who. that I could just quickly put together. Um, Greatly educated. Well, let's throw Moses in there. That's a pretty good one. Moses had very good formal education. Daniel in the Old Testament, very good formal education. And let's not forget Paul in the New Testament, who was on track to be part of the leadership of Israel before he had his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. He was Saul of Tarsus at that time. All three of those gentlemen had great background in education. All three of those gentlemen, it was not an impediment. It wasn't necessary. It was just part of their background, and they went on to do great things for God. In more modern biblical histories, you had St. Augustine. How about this? Martin Luther was formally trained. Billy Graham in my generation had a seminary degree. So there's plenty of examples of individuals who had formal education that God used greatly. How about the unformally educated camp? Well, in the Bible, you'd have to have people like, um, well, we just ran across Peter and John, but the very biggest one I could think of is Jesus. Of course, had no formal education in any of the rabbinical schools, and yet he was the greatest. He's far more than just a teacher, but he was the greatest teacher ever. Um, so there's some biblical examples. Don't forget Paul, who would go on to spread the gospel to the Gentiles of the world. Had a formal education, but you could contrast him with Peter and John. Peter and John had no formal education, and yet look at what they went from 120 believers to at least 5,000, if not 10 or 15,000 people by the time that this event is occurring in front of the Sanhedrin. That's a massive growth rate from two uneducated people. How about after them? Are there others after Peter and John, since Paul doesn't fit the mold? Well, yeah, there are. How about somebody I quote from a lot in class is Charles Spurgeon, had no formal education of this. D.L. Moody had no formal education of this. And then some of the greatest, William Carey, Martin Lloyd-Jones. How about Hudson Taylor, who brought the gospel to Asia? There's tons of people who have not had formal education, and they have been used mightily of God. So, what is the answer? The answer is you do whatever God tells you to do, and it doesn't matter whether you have formal education or no formal education. You have a willing heart that God uses you, and He'll tell you whether to do the education route or not. And just be open and willing to be used of God, and that's all you need. That's all you need. I'd like to do a little um, sidebar before we close out this section of verse 13. This is not an application. This isn't a lesson. This is just something I thought about during the week that I thought was interesting. Um, it's interesting to see what the Jewish leaders did and how they handled this, but it's equally interesting to see what they didn't do. Okay, their role is to protect the Jewish faith against any sects or cults that come up that might pollute the people's mind. Okay, we already discussed this. Their motives were not pure, um, but that is one of the reasons I tried to give some legitimacy to them hauling Peter and John before them. Um, you notice what they didn't do. Here they've got this, in their view, heretic cult of Judaism that's arising that they have to squash out. Why didn't they challenge the resurrection of Jesus that Peter is preaching? They left that hanging because I believe they didn't have a good argument against the resurrection of Jesus. Just remember, this had only been a few weeks ago. The 500 people Jesus had appeared to, they're all still walking around testifying that they saw the risen Lord. This is really tough sledding if you're going to try to take out a budding faith that's based on a lie. But it wasn't based on a lie. I think it was based on fact. And I think the Sadducees knew that, and the chief priests knew that, and they let this opportunity pass to nip this rising movement in the bud, to put it down before it got out of hand. And they did absolutely nothing to challenge that miracle or the miracle of the lame man, because they couldn't, because they knew they were true. So I love at the end how they give the credit. Here's these leaders that are false leaders, but they don't give the credit to the Holiday Inn Express. The reason these guys are so on point and so piercing in their logic is because they had spent time with Jesus. And my encouragement to you is, shouldn't that be the way we compose ourselves in our society today? Shouldn't people know who we are and who we've spent time with because of our words and our actions? We should be those ambassadors, the salt of the earth, the light to a dark world, and Peter and John were. All right, we're going to pick back up in verse 14. Thanks for this section.